Hello, everyone, and welcome to Phoenix Gaming. I am your host, Nick Henning, and today we're going to be talking about engineers specifically in the Great Western Trail world. This is, in my opinion, the weakest strategy. Let's say we're already moving to our first topic. The weakest strategy in Great Western Trail. There's a handful of reasons for that. I think that builders just have the most powerful game plan, the ability to throw a bunch of taxers on the board and then make those really big, powerful, the 8-9 buildings that make all of your decisions for you, essentially, really can direct you in just a very clear and poignant path that lets you control the flow of the game for other players. I do think that building is generally the strongest strategy. And Cowboys is really good too, improving the quality of your deck and the ability to convert cash into victory points at a very good ratio very easily throughout the game makes Cowboys just a very versatile strategy that is quite powerful. Engineering, I think, is the hardest strategy to execute in this game, and I think it's the weakest strategy to execute in this game. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't, and of course it doesn't mean that engineers don't win this game. It is just my personal experience, and I don't have data to back this up, that the engineering strategy just lags behind the other two a little bit. And so I wanted to spend some time today talking about how to play engineers, what you're thinking about when you're doing engineers, and how to take advantage of what I think is generally perceived as the weakest strategy in Great Western Trail. To that point, I think that it is very important to play engineers primarily in games where they are open and available, where the board is extremely favorable to them, which is pretty rare. We're going to talk about that a little bit later when we talk about far range engineers in particular. But basically, you want the board to be set up in such a way that you're going to be able to take these actions without disrupting your flow, without having to work too hard at traveling through the rest of the game. It does depend a lot on what other people are doing along the way. In terms of setup for the players, I would say that engineering strategy is largely building agnostic. It doesn't care too much about what buildings are available. Frankly, you should be focusing more on the building actions. And this difference of which buildings are available is not that important. There's a couple level 3 buildings that specifically reward engineering strategy, and yes, you can get into them, particularly if you pick up some builders and then maybe you drop those builder off in a station master. So there are games where you might stumble into that being relevant somewhere, but I'm going to say for the majority of games, you shouldn't make your decision about how good engineers are going to be based off of the buildings that are in play. That's really different from when I talked about Cowboys, where with Cowboys, certain buildings make the Cowboy strategy completely different in terms of how powerful it's going to be in the game. That just isn't true for builders in the same way, but for engineers in the same way. And so I think that that's not too important to consider. I do think that there's a couple buildings that are maybe a little bit better for engineers. Like you would much prefer the hazard remover building, particularly if the hazard station master tile is out there. You'd prefer usually for the level 1 buildings rather than the one building that can be level 1 or level 2 to all be in play, because there's the one station master tile that gives you points for every building that you have in play. So that certainly is an option that might slightly make a difference. And then of course there's the starting building where you can discard a green cow for 2 move. And that can be helpful to get started with a station master focused strategy. But again, I wouldn't really focus my game plan on, I'm going to pay attention to engineers because of this. It should end up being a little bit more incidental. So one of the things that is exciting about engineers is the fact that they have a very high score ceiling. Now, you could argue that hybrid strategies or, the builder's nuts with being able to remove hazards is also a really high score ceiling, and that's fine. But just by default, I think that the engineer has the highest score ceiling of the 3 primary strategies in the game. Just from what's printed on the board, the problem that they have is they end up running out of time. We're going to talk about that a little bit more when we talk about the styles of play that I think are appropriate for the engineer. But let's look at exactly what it is that is so impressive about their scoring potential here. It's very obvious on the back half of the track here, this 6, 7, 8, 9 victory points at decreasing price values for having gone along the way there. Moving into that ringing the bell spot, that last space 39 where you pay $3, get $3 back, get 9 points and back up the train anywhere. is easily worth 15 plus points, and in some absurd situations, maybe even worth over 20 points. An absolutely massive swing that you can pull out. And the question is, are you going to get there? Ringing the bell or getting to the end of the track here is kind of one of the primary questions of, is the engineer player going to win this game? It is possible. I have seen engineer players win the game without ringing the bell, particularly when we talk about the Station Master strategy later. But I think that more times than not, this like hitting this metric is that if you have tried to play engineer and you're not ringing the bell by the time that the game ends, and that's really what you focus on doing. If you're one of those people who is watching my video and saying, I just don't even know how other people go to that side of the track, I think you're probably going to need to focus a lot more just for practice on very, very linearly focusing on buying engineers, moving that train, and doing very little else just to see that it is indeed plausible to get to the end of the track there. You just need the time to make it happen. If you focus solely on this task, you can absolutely do it. But even in games where you're not focusing solely on this task, it is plausible to ring the bell. It's just about learning how to weave your actions and the engineer along the way, which I'll talk a lot about a little bit more when I dive into the styles. The other thing is that, of course, these point salad-y Station Master tiles are they're very interesting because they score differently from most other things in the game, and that you can score something for this and for an objective. So they sort of feel very like cream on top. They feel like the only kind of scoring in the game that does not stand alone on its own, but sort of takes from what your other structures are. I have them here in like a kind of rough tier list. The top one is, and for engineers specifically, the top one is just the absolute best tile for engineers. It is essentially a free 6, 9, 12 points and that perma-cert along the way. So being able to get this guy is just so important towards that strategy. Ideally, when you are playing an engineer strategy, you actually don't want this in the first station, because that's the one that other players might get to grab along the way. If you're a focused engineer and they're maybe picking up one engineer and trying to take a Station Master or something like that, and people will take this because it has that perma certificate on it. But there's just so many extra points from this that ideally for you, this is in like the 3rd, 4th, or 5th station. You kind of pick it up later in your run. You don't have to compete with other players for it. It's very, very convenient. So this is actually, I said that the buildings don't change me for engineering strategy. If I see this in slots 3, 4, or 5, maybe even the second slot, it does change my evaluation of this a fair amount. This second one is just broadly very good. The ability to turn certificates into points, especially if you have multiple certificates or perma certificates. It's just nice free points that way, and it does some work over the course of the game. Again, I think this one is nice if it's not in the first slot, because you're less likely to have to compete with other opponents to grab it. So it's a really interesting tile for that reason. For the same reason, the perma cert with the bandits is in there. Usually this is an easy 3 points. It might be 6 points. It's probably going to cap out at 6 points. And you might have to do some extra work to get those 6 points, like take less money than you'd have expected to, or stop a fewer times. 4 bandits in a game is fully reasonable. 6 is probably not going to happen. So it just has a lower ceiling than the ones above it does. But it's still a very good tile and just generically useful. This one on the left here obviously gives no real value at the beginning, but can be worth probably 6, 7, 8 points if you have, you get 2 points or 3 points just for your starting guys, and then maybe you buy 5 extra engineers along the way, kind of in the ideal situation. And so it being worth those points is very valuable. I don't like this tile as much as other people do. I recognize that it's got sort of a fair amount of points on it, but the hit that it takes you, that you're losing that worker in the middle of the game to grab it, is really a pain in the butt. I actually kind of like this one best as the very fifth slot on this track right here, right at the end, because that by then I can kind of decide whether I want to get it or not. And worst case scenario, people kind of forget this a lot, but you can use the backup from ringing the bell and back up into a station. So that could be a nice sneaky way to get this right at the end of the game. Although, usually the points that you get for getting it, if you're getting rid of like your 6th engineer to get it, it ends up not being worthwhile as well. This one is really interesting. Generally, it's going to be worth 0 or 3 points. However, if you have that tile, the level 2 building that lets you pay 5 and remove a hazard, it actually might be that you could build an entire strategy out of this and focus on basically claiming points from those hazards and then converting them into extra points. Every hazard essentially being worth an extra 1.5. This can be sort of like a strategy almost on its own, and it can't really be on its own, but this moves up a lot higher in the list if that one particular building is available. This one is really interesting here. I don't love it, but it's really good to compare to this station master tile. So this one gives you a better immediate benefit. The 2 certificates is generally pretty good. The thing that you have to watch out for is making sure that you have certificates like kind of cleared and available to claim when you take this tile. So if you're planning on taking it, just be very forward looking as you are managing your certs, particularly in the engineer strategy. It's easily worth 4 points, might be worth 6 points, maybe even worth 8 points, depending on kind of how your setup is. And maybe you had some engineers or builders along the way that facilitated putting a couple more buildings in play, and was a game you really wanted to put buildings out. So I like that it has a very good point scoring flex along the way there. The thing that is actually really important to name about this one, though, is that the builder player gets so many points for claiming this. And if you are playing in a game with a 4-4-4, the get $4, move the train 4 spaces, and walk 4 spaces building, and you have the opportunity to grab this before that builder player, it might just straight up be your responsibility to claim this to prevent the builder from getting it, because it is just so nutty good for them that taking it off the table is well worthwhile alone. So while I don't think it's that good for the engineering strategy, paying attention to who can get it is very important. I think it's maybe unsurprising that this is my least favorite of them. That being said, I still grab it plenty of times. The immediate benefit can be very good depending on how much money you're getting from the bandit, depending on what kind of hazard you're removing from board. Is it good points? Is it removing from a path that you need? Functionally, you can treat this as like $5. The top of this is like $5 roughly, with either the bandit or the removal of the hazard. The 2 objectives thing, it's very easy to get 3 points. You can get 6 points. I sometimes see people get 9 points, but usually that's the expense of other points because they're not completing all of those objectives. A little funky. Tends to be my least favorite one, the one that I end up skipping most often in the order here. All right, let's talk about far range station masters. So this is a strategy where you're really focused on getting around and ringing the bell, like I said, and there's quite a lot of points that you can get from doing that. So I think most people kind of notice this flow of from sort of Kansas City, you can travel 5 spaces and get into this location, 4 to get into this location, 4 to get into this location, 4 to get into this location, and 4 to get into the last station master location, picking up all those points along the way and possibly station masters as well. However, I think that this is a trap. I think that if you're playing a station master strategy, and we're going to talk about hybrid a little bit, like you do want to pick up some stations along the way, but if you are planning on getting to the end of the road, you should not be picking up every station, and you should not be stopping in a lot of these spaces. Spending $2 for a victory point on those first 2 stations is like not that good. Yes, it's nice that you can upgrade, and the engineer strategy cares about upgrading their discs more than any other strategy. But by a certain point in the game, you're actually just going to have so many discs in play that you're kind of doing pointless upgrades anyway. And so being able to be a little bit more patient with it, I think is much more impactful if you are playing a far range focused strategy. The other thing that will even happen is if you're playing a game that ends up going longer, which is not common amongst folks that are very experienced, but it's not impossible. And it's certainly, there's plenty of time in a game if you are still playing with folks who are getting a little bit more experienced, you will get into the situation where you run out of discs on your board to place, and you actually have to remove discs from earlier in the station track in order to use them later in the station track, which is worth it at that time. But then it begs the question of whether you should have placed those earlier discs anyway. And my suggestion here is that the answer is no. What I want you to understand from this movement pattern here is that 3 movements of 4 gets you from this station to this station to this station, but also 2 movements of 5, right? If I was in this station and I moved up to space number 9 here, another 5 movement, 3, 4, 5, gets me into this farther away station. So if you're willing to skip over 2 stations, 2 actions at 5 movement rather than 3 actions at 4 movement gets you there. And that is far more efficient in terms of having additional actions in the future, making those choices where you're only picking up certain stations along the way. I think that if you're playing far-ranging strategy, 2, maybe 3 station masters should be your tops in terms of trying to get all the way to the end of the board. It is certainly plausible to pick up 4 or 5 and ring the bell in a longer game, but I think it's not going to be likely if you're playing with folks who are interested in trying to beat you and are focused on, really quick cowboy strategies, or just build up and then kind of rush the end of the game from the builder strategy as well. So being disciplined about taking only a few of the options along the way here can be really, really helpful. Figuring out how to do the hybrid is the last thing I'm going to talk about. So just let's focus on this idea that you are only going to take 2 stations along the way. It doesn't even need to be this first station here. This 5-5 thing works well. If you're picking up the 2nd and 5th stations or something like that. It also even can work okay using auxiliary actions and things like that. Coming out 5 spaces, let's say that you did go to the 2nd station, you came out 5 spaces to space 12 here, and you really wanted this 4th station. Well, an auxiliary action that lets you move 2 spaces forward, or the bandit action replacement that lets you move 2 spaces forward, puts you into this station, and then another 4 or 5 move gets you down here. Now, it's really likely that you do want to stop at this station one way or another. Paying $6 for 3 points and a black disc is very valuable. Stopping in this station is worthwhile. Do not think that you must play a station master in order to stop in the station. And so I think that it's fully plausible to pick up 2 stations along the way, stop in here to put a 3rd disc down so that you can get that early additional black disc into play, probably for that movement action, is a completely reasonable choice and strategy along the way without taking the station master, depending on how good that tile is for you, depending on what your worker situation looks like. Just taking station masters blind is not a wise choice. Okay, so how do I know if I want to play a far range strategy? All right, this is true for all engineer strategies, but it's especially true for the far-ranging strategies. You need the board to be set up in such a way that moving is preferable to you. This is a board that I just played on where I played engineers and I came in, I think, dead last. It was second to last. It was not a good game for me. From the initial setup here, it looks just fine. I can kind of move from the starting position into this, end my track with this, but this is a pretty bad board because if this board starts getting cluttered, and usually where clutter tends to be is the beginning, because people understand that taxes are better at the beginning of the trail, if we get more hazards, and we get more tax buildings in the middle here, all of a sudden moving out of the gate here and trying to get to this location is pretty miserable. You're going to pay a lot of money along the way and might not have enough money left to do your travel actions. Ideally, you want one of the engineer places to be here on the board. This bottom left this bottom left corner is probably the most important location in the whole game for any strategy whatsoever. The building that is here, the neutral building that is here, I think impacts the game flow more than anything else from the initial setup of the game. So if you have one of these buildings, one of the engineer buildings here, that's great. And, like I said, engineer is sort of a building agnostic strategy in terms of the buildings you place, but it really cares about what the board looks like. And in fact, that's one of the things that I think makes engineering such a, quote unquote, weak strategy in comparison to the other one, is that you are at the whims of the structure of the initial part of the game. And a lot of times when you stumble into playing engineers, you're not necessarily considering where those actions are, but your rondel that's been designed is chosen for you at the beginning, and how good an engineer is depends a lot on how that's set up. So if this is your starting location right here, and then the other one is right here, that's pretty ideal because you essentially have your 1-2 drops that you need to go to. If you need to stop at other buildings along the way to take those actions, you can. But in the late game, you're going to be able to just go bam, first action, bam, second action. Yes, you might need to pay some taxes along the way. So ideally, there's some money in the middle. If it's going to be a tax heavy game, maybe some money in the middle. Because there's like the hazard remover or the bandits that go in the middle here. And then one of your buildings is maybe like here closer to the end. So you can kind of do like a 1, 2, 3 situation. That's what you want the end of your game to look like. It's possible, yes, of course, that there's certain buildings that you've played that you're going to want to stop on. But like I said, they're mostly not buildings that the engineers care about, and most of the ones that are good for engineers actually just kind of move you another space into the location. So something like that, discard 2 of the same cow, move 1 space. Sure, that's great here if I also have an engineer building here, and other players are less likely to want to take that spot because they don't care about sliding the extra space into that location. So you might be able to sneak it in kind of a little bit later than you would in a normal structure for a game. So those kinds of setups can be really helpful for an engineer, but really you're going to be taking these actions in play. So ideally this spot, and then somewhere around here where you can get to from this location. That's not the only one that makes this viable. I've seen good games where literally the first spot, which is normally not amazing, but you always have money and you can move there. And then like something like this or this, so you could go 1, 2, and then depending on what's in the last part of the map here, maybe something that gives you money so that you can kind of start off in the next lap is certainly a viable option. The far range strategy also does care a bit about where this is for the beginning of the game, but because you're not going to be constantly buying employees, because you're not buying that many station masters, you don't need to be going here later in the game. Probably tax hell hasn't been set up yet, so you're actually not punished if this building is later in the road, where you are really punished for that, for other station master, for like other engineer strategies that focus on station masters where you need to keep buying people over and over and over again. The idea with far range is that you're able to essentially like buy up to 5 engineers pretty quickly. Maybe you go down a little bit, drop engineers to pick up a station or 2 along the way, and then like re-trigger the discount hiring from the engineer to fix that problem. That's kind of your ideal goal as you're working your way through the turn. So since we're on it, let's just go straight into this. Your goal is to get online fast. You are trying to get to a point where you are moving every time you're moving 4 or 5 spaces. And so generally the far range strategy, what happens is you want to double hire engineers as your first hire action of the game. You'll probably stumble into this because there's a lot of engineers available on the hiring track. So a lot of engineers available, and you picked up some money. Maybe it was kind of like a map where, actually maybe just exactly like this map, where you decided not to start with a purchase, but you maybe discarded some gray cows at the beginning and then delivered. And maybe people were before you in turn order, so they scooped up some of the other builders or cowboys or whatever, and you're seeing that engineers are kind of open, and there are a certain number of engineers available for play. In this game that I lost, there were not enough engineers, but there was nothing else going on. Didn't go very well. You can see that like coming down the line, there's a couple more engineers, there's some engineers in play. Once you buy them, other players should be very disincentivized from buying them as well, because it's going to be harder for them. And so you buy 2 engineers, stake your claim in the ground, and then the next time you come to this location, you buy your 4th engineer. And that's where it gets interesting, because you can decide to buy a 5th engineer, or a lot of times what I'll do instead is I'll buy a second builder or a second cowboy. Because that second builder or second cowboy is going to get thrown into one of the stations that I'm going at along the way. And I'm already moving 4 spaces. In fact, let me show the player board. All right, I didn't script this well, so now we're off back into the top engineer spaces because I don't know exactly where this fits, but this is really important to talk about, which is just general engineer purchasing. So I was saying that I need to move this to the bottom. I was saying that you should buy. Oh, why are you doing this? Great. You should buy 2 engineers, right, in your first clip here, and then when you buy another engineer, you get a discount purchase. And most people's option, they go straight and excited for these, and that's all fine and good. But if you are planning on stopping for a couple station masters, I actually think there's a really good argument to be made for buying another one of these other people instead. The reason is that now, right, I've essentially made a double purchase and I've made a single purchase, which then segued into a discount. Maybe you can buy even another worker here, but you have to be really rich for this to happen. So I find this situation of 4-2 to be more common, even if you can technically have bought more at this stage. This stage meaning that I've gone and purchased employees only 2 times. So what happens now is I have a movement of 4. And presumably, maybe someone has moved on the track, or I've at least unlocked one of these movement discs right here. So now I can move 4 or 5 spaces somehow, get into that first station. When I get to that first station, I can then throw away this guy, and I still have a move of 4. Now I can move 4, getting into the second station, bam, throw away this guy. And then the next time I go higher, I get to re-trigger this bonus again. If I'm going for 3 stations, which we said is the maximum, we're not going for more than that. If I'm going for 3 stations, I might just, buy a ton of these guys if I have ones in my hand, or if they're not available or they're coming later on the track, like maybe we buy whatever, another employee, a second one of these guys, something like that, right? We fill up to something like this and we start shooting down the track, dropping in, maybe on that 4th or 5th station spot to throw away this last cowboy. And now we don't ever need to hire again. So essentially through the course of having gone to 4 folks, having stopped at 2 stations, right? So 2 hire actions gets us all this, 1 double hire, and then a single hire with the discount. We then drop in 2 stations, something like that. Now we stop and hire again. This, we can do a double hire and this hire, and because we haven't been stopping to hire as much as other players, we might be able to do something like this, or frankly, it doesn't matter. Something like this works just fine, and we can do a 3rd station along the way. So that's why 3 stations kind of is, I would say, the cap for the far range strategy as far as I'm focused, because that kind of flow, I think, works really well. While we're looking at the player board, let's also just briefly talk about, I think, the order of removing these things. I do think that the extra move space is really important. It lets you kind of clean up. If you can't quite move 5 because, you're at the spot where you only have 3 of them, having both of these discs removed means that you have a way of moving 5, because one of those engineering move spaces lets you move 2 additional spaces. By default, I don't love moving 3 spaces. If you have nothing else to do, it's fine. I really do want to be moving 4 or 5 most of the time when I'm taking this action. I think a lot of times I see people going for long range and they're like willing to take actions where they're only moving 2 spaces. And it sometimes is worth it to just skip doing a move so that you can reset your lap, get some money, and then buy more engineers so you can take some real actions rather than these kind of like half-assed, really sad actions. After that, I do like having a backup for some cuteness. If you want to like move somewhere and then back up into the station, I tend to take the trash one, but that's also because I tend to at least buy 1 cow when I'm playing an engineer strategy. I like buying a 3-year cow, and then between that single 3-year cow and my stations that probably give me a couple perma certificates, and I'm getting certificates as this, I can do an 8, 10, 12 delivery over the course of the game, not worry about claiming too many negative points by playing on the lower part of the delivery track. So I do think that it's very valuable as an engineer to do that. So shredding my deck of some of the crappier cards can be helpful. Plus this gives me money. This is certainly valuable maybe later in the game. And then of course we always like taking money. So I would say that when I'm doing engineers, if I know for a fact I'm doing engineers, I will usually unlock this as my very first disc rather than this, unless I know for a fact that I don't need the movement and I do need the dollars, and I'll be able to unlock this afterwards. But I like unlocking this action. Just getting ahead on the track when you need to kind of bounce over people can be very important to get online pretty quickly. I also find that this like far range strategy is not necessarily the most money hungry. If you stop in and you pick up like a couple bandits here and there, there's not enough taxers usually in play at the beginning of the game to slow this down enough. It will get a lot harder later, but at this stage, you can usually get online, and that is what we were talking about. Getting online fast. We're back on track here. All right, let's go. I've already kind of alluded to this a lot in terms of the moving 2 or 3 spaces, but actions really, really matter. Not dilly-dallying with other nonsense in the game. You're going to buy maybe one more cow. You're going to build maybe 1 or 2 buildings, but frankly, you want that building spot to be somewhere where you don't care about. You probably are not going to go there. You're probably not going to be removing that many hazards because the money is a little bit difficult. You're going to maybe once per lap stop and get money, which might be discarding 2 cows for $4, or it might be stopping at the bandits or something like that. But you really do want to, once you get online, focus on essentially like move the train, deliver, move the train, deliver, and then usually some 4th action in that. So it's going to be move the train, buy another guy, move the train, deliver. But move the train, pick up some money, move the train, deliver. Something like that is your ideal lap. You actually do want to be going pretty fast. It does accelerate towards the end of the game, but it's going to maximize the number of times you are taking the move action, getting you towards the end of the board there, where you get to ding, 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 hit those huge points along the side. Speaking of, let's talk about the edge of the board. Okay, I've talked about 5 engineers a lot rather than 6, which of course 6 is better than 5, but 5 is the magic number that you need for the far-ranging strategy. If you notice on the right-hand side of the track, you're going to be moving from this station to this station to this station to this station, and all of those are 5 spaces exactly away from each other. Unlike the station master ones where I'm advocating that you do skip some of those spaces, you really don't want to be skipping most of these spaces. Probably this first one you'll skip. I'll get a little bit more into that about why in a minute. But these other ones right here, you want to like hit this, and then get to the end here. Now you can skip one of these so that you can get to the end. Again, I'll get to that in a minute. And I do want to point out that at the end here, the movement is 6, not 5, which always gets in my way and is very frustrating. But if you move 5 out of here and then you just use an auxiliary action to move the 1 extra space, you can get there. So that tends to be enough. And again, you need to have $3 to pay, but you immediately get the $3 back when you land in this location if you're thinking about like where you're going to back up to and how much money you need in order to like do a double delivery, right, to this and somewhere else. So 5 is the magic number, and usually you're going to do this with 5 engineers. Now, I have actually gone on this side of the track with 3 engineers and used 3 engineers in the double auxiliary action, which you might say, hey, that's only on one of the engineer spaces. But I did 3 engineers, double auxiliary, go to the bandit spot, double auxiliary, go to the other spot. And that was a way that I forced my train essentially to chug across the backside here. So you can do this with as few as 3 engineers. Less than that, this is basically impossible. And you need to make sure that you have an appropriate money to do that. 4 is an awkward number here. You can definitely do some things, but I'm gonna recommend that you end up using more skips to be clever. I'm gonna let you count that out in terms of what you'd want to do. I'd recommend trying to just not be in the situation where you have 4 engineers. Like 3 or 5 does really feel better because you'll just be doing single auxiliary actions a lot of the time with 4, and that just sucks. And 6, of course, is even better still because 6 engineers certainly can move 5, and then also you can just move the full 6 at the end there. But you sometimes just can't get to 6 very conveniently, or in order to get the 6th one, you have to like stop and take another action to buy the 6th guy. And what I'm here to advocate for is that you really don't need that 6th guy. You can buy that 6th guy anytime later in the game when it's convenient, when it's in the bottom rows of $6, $5, $4, so that you can just get the 4 points for the extra guy there. If you're able to get it earlier, great, more power to you, but it's not essential. 5 is just fine. This is a little bit different from builders where like 4 or 6 is the magic number. 5 tends to be pretty bad. And Cowboys, I think actually 4 is really good and 5 is really good, but 6 is like not that impressive. This is closer to that. So the other thing I want to show you is that the 5 movements, you can do exactly what we're looking at here, but this is actually, I think, the magic key for far range strategy. You deliver to the black disc location here. Then from there, you move 5 spaces. Everyone who's gone around this corner knows how horrible this corner is. It's very difficult to get into this spot. And yes, $8 for 5 points is a good ratio, but it's not an incredible ratio. If you think about the hazard removal spot, $7 for removing a hazard, which might be 4 points, this is quite similar to that, and people skip that a fair amount early in the game, though they will do it later in the game because I do think it's good value later in the game. That being said, I think it's fine for you to skip it. If you move 5 spaces here, then it turns out that another 5 spaces gets you into this location, another 5 spaces gets you into this location, another 5 spaces skips this location, because now you're only 5 spaces away from the end rather than the 6 because you came out at the beginning here. I think I moved this dot a little bit low, but it's something like this. And so you go 1 move, 2 move, 3 move, 4 move, 5 move. You'll notice that no auxiliary actions were required to do this entire thing. So in 5 moves with 5 workers, you can get all the way to the end here. And then you can use this backup from this location and back up into this spot right here. Because you might say, well, how are you skipping this, $5 8 points? I'm absolutely not. I'm just collecting it on the back end here, and I'll have these two. If I'm able to hit this and get this, and then from here I can back up here and get these points, that's great. But I find that I do this sequence so much, and I think it's the best 5 move sequence that exists. Again, you can do this with 3 engineers, but it's more taxing on the auxiliary actions. But doing this with 5 is just great. You need to make sure that you have 5 actions though, which means you need to go around the lap 3 times, right? Because you can only do it 2 times per lap. And so you're trying to hit this spot right here before you're going to have 3 more times around the cycle. And, a good rule of thumb is that every time you deliver is going to be 2 rows on the track. So if we count this backwards, you're hoping that about 6 rows on the track are empty by the time you've gotten to this location and you have 5 engineers. That's kind of your goal in terms of timing. Cool. That's far range. Let's talk about Station Master strategy, or what I like to call the exploding engineers strategy. This is my favorite strategy in the game. I think that it is not the most powerful, but it is the most fun. It's also very weird. The idea of exploding Station Masters is that you are not planning to get to the end of the track. All this stuff on the right here, this is no longer a part of our game. We do not care about it at all. We're done with it. We're just focused essentially on the first leg of the track here and picking up as many, maybe even all 5 or 4 or 5 station tiles here. You can play this strategy when someone else is playing long range engineers. Usually 2 people going engineers is death for both of those players. But it might be a game where there's a ton of engineers in play, or all of the strategies look really bad. I've certainly played games where it's like cowboys are just like unplayable because there's no supporting cowboy buildings. The one cowboy market is in like the cow market is in like the worst possible place. And so no one is playing cowboys. So you might, look at this then. Same kind of thing can happen. I think Builders is the only one that's like probably sort of good no matter what, but it's also possible for the Builder setup to be pretty awkward, that you're not going to have extra contests there. I really like my radioactive looking hair here. And so let's talk about exploding Station Masters. So the idea here is that you need to jockey for position over other people. The hardest thing about this is timing and paying a lot of attention to where your opponents are, when your opponents are. If you want to see this in action, you want to watch the 2024 finals where I lose with this strategy, but I talk a lot about how I manage my movement along the way and what I'm paying attention to as I try this strategy and fail to beat out the real strats. But I get close. The hardest part of exploding Station Masters is getting off the ground. Probably you're starting the game with like a non-committal 1-1 setup. And the one thing that's really nice about exploding Station Masters is it allows for a lot of pivot or hybrid strategies naturally. So you might be doing a 1-1 setup. You might even double by engineers. It doesn't really matter because your goal is to get into this first station here in some fashion. And when you get into this first station, let's rotate this. When you get into this first station here, you're then pitching and you're probably down to 2 engineers. Now, hopefully what you've done is you've removed one of these discs already. And then when you get into the station, you remove a second disc. And now you notice you have an auxiliary that lets you move 2 spaces and engineers that lets you move 2 spaces. And so you can do a move 2 and get straight into like a engineer 2, auxiliary 2, and get straight into this second location here and get rid of this engineer. And voila, you've claimed 2 Station Masters. At its very, very basic level, this can be exploding Station Masters. You can claim the first 2 stations and be done with it for the rest of the game. You don't even need to care about any of the rest of the stuff. But you can, if you want to, depending on what your opponents are doing, how they're moving, what the builder situation looks like, you might just fully pivot into a different strategy at this stage, particularly depending on which stations you get, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But you might end up just picking up more stuff. Again, you can kind of do like 2-2 splits, and you can do the move two situation to essentially bounce the 4 into the next station. It is also, so you can do that and kind of just truck along the way trying to get things. I think this is a particularly more impactful strategy when you have an engineer player that's kind of starting to get out of the gates, and you can bounce off of them for an extra movement along the way, because every movement saved for you is an extra $1. You also, if you're able to get to 3 engineers and bounce off of somebody, this is a 4 movement suddenly. This is a really, really big deal. This doesn't come up often because players tend to be wary about moving in such positions. But if you have the opportunity to buy to 3 engineers and someone has moved in such a way that you can jump over them, and then that would allow you to get into like the 3rd station here, toss this engineer up here, and then now I can do move two, and that gets me here, and I maybe claimed like the first 4 stations. That's very, very exciting. So great ways to just kind of like nuke that whole strategy, buy some stations. You don't need to get all of them, but you can. And then, by the way, it's worth pointing out that even if the engineer player beats you to this last station and claims that tile, if you are here over the course of the game, even without having any other like engineers picked up, you can auxiliary here and auxiliary into the last spot in order just for this 6-3 and a black disc. Entirely reasonable and not out of the realm of a value to you. So something to pay attention to along the way. The other way to do exploding engineers is to get engineers pretty early. So maybe you do that double engineer buy that I mentioned. You do the same thing that I mentioned earlier where you like buy an engineer and something else. Now you've got to move 4. And let's say you've unlocked one of these discs where you find a way to bounce over someone to try to get in here. Or if someone's taken this location already and you're just kind of like doing a move and then your second move gets you in here, right? Move 4 and then another 4 gets you here. That's fine too. And you pitch an engineer here. Then you, actually, let's say that you pitch a builder here. Then you have a move 4 that gets you here. After that, you do move 3 and auxiliary 1, which is a little awkward, gets you here. And then a move 2 and auxiliary 2, which gets you here. So you could have built for a full-on far-range strategy and switch into an exploding engineers if, for instance, you are seeing that absolutely no more engineers are coming out in play, right? And that you are worried that that's just going to make it so that you can't have the employees that you need. That is certainly like a viable pivot at certain points. And that's really what makes the Station Master strategy so fun. I guess I'm going out of order here, but the ability to pivot with this strategy into or out of various strategies. Because once you've claimed anywhere between 2 and 4 or all 5 station tiles, you now kind of need to do something else with the rest of your game. And you can if you set it up fast enough. I actually think in a lot of ways, claiming 4 station tiles seems to be the best rather than trying to claim 5 or even just 3 or 4 of them is pretty good, because then you could pivot into something else. The important thing is that once you pivot out of this strategy, you don't want to have extra engineers left over. You don't want to have 2 or 3 engineers trying to piddle your way around the corner of the track here. And yes, I did just talk about how far range can be done with 3 engineers, but you would know whether that's viable or not based on how much time is left in the game. And usually the strategy dilly-dallies a lot more. You are buying extra cows along the way, or you're putting more buildings in play, depending which of these station master tiles you've taken and which essentially like secondary employees you've taken along the way that can allow you to influence the game state a little bit. So let's talk about what stations are interesting in doing this. Certainly, the same one that we talked about before, that's the GOAT for all engineering strategies, is still true. This is an easy 3, but almost certainly 6 points and a perma-cert. This is really, really amazing. This one also tends to be really good. Again, a very easy 3 and then usually pretty easy 6, maybe even 9 or 12, depending on how you set it up at the end of the game, because you can use these actions to back up and get certificates to end the game out. These 2 are really, really good if they're in the earlier slots and you can claim them. The other cert guys are good. This one's probably 3 points, maybe 6 points, and does the certificate thing, which is great. It improves our deliveries. This is the most interesting of them. If you are able to get the building in play that's pay $5, remove a hazard, and bump, then this all of a sudden can become top tier, maybe even like top tier, because Station Master strategy requires you to have a way to pivot into scoring points later in the game, because once we have no employees, we suck at taking the actions. Whereas like Cowboys are going to be buying crazy Cowboys, engineers are going to be delivering, builders are going to be building huge buildings, and we're not doing anything. This all of a sudden makes it so that when we're removing hazards, we're doing something far more exciting. So if we're able to pick up particularly a second builder along the way, build that building, and then we grab this, that is pretty exciting stuff. This can be entirely like here or here, especially if you're able to like get them pretty early. That can lead to some really, really exciting moments. So pay attention for opportunities to exploit that. This building is probably a little bit more valuable for exploding Station Masters than it is for the far range guys, because you're moving 2 certificates down, and you can easily get 4 or 6 points. This is just a way to drop a couple extra buildings in play, care about having them, and just have like a handful of like little options. This isn't anything I'd structure my game around, but I'm always very happy to take this one. This one actually moves up in valuation when you're playing the strategy, in large part because you're going to be focusing on claiming more bandits, claiming more hazards. You have more time available to you, and so you can complete more objectives. And you've got a lot of these locations. You might also be pivoting into Cowboys at some point, or bought a couple cows because you had a second Cowboy here. And so all of a sudden, the ability to do multiple objectives is very, very feasible. And so you might be you're getting 3 points for sure, but you might be getting 6 points. And this gave you points or money right off the bat when you played it. And this combo with this one is a nice little soft combo. So this one moves up in valuation quite a bit when we're focusing on a Station Master strategy. And this one, conversely, plummets into the ground. You are trying to end the game with maybe no employees, and this one just becomes absolute crap. So you're actively looking to avoid this one and hoping that the engineer player will stumble into it and think that they've gotten one up on you because you're not interested in it. If you watch my 2024 game, you'll see that I picked it up, and that was a very dumb choice. Cool. The other thing I want to talk about with pivoting here is once you've exploded out, particularly if you've just claimed the first 2 and you're done there, but also if you've claimed these other ones, you want to ask yourself what you're doing for the rest of the game. And I think the most viable option for the rest of the game is picking up some cheap Cowboys, particularly if people are not competing for the Cowboy market. Cowboys are not the like sexiest strategy, particularly at high level. And so there a lot of times ends up being sort of like freebie Cowboys in play. Having 2 Cowboys is fine, but having 3 Cowboys is enough to turn any cow market action into a very profitable money to victory point exchange. And so I oftentimes, when I'm playing this strategy, will pivot into having 3 Cowboys, making some buys throughout the course of the game. If I have the opportunity to buy a 4th Cowboy, great, because it gives me points right when I do it. I don't often pivot into doing a builder strategy from this just because there isn't enough time to really reap the benefits of those builder actions. So I might build along the way, but almost never pivot into. I really like pivoting into Cowboys. That was the 2020-24 plan. But it just depends on whether these Cowboys are available and whether the other players are going to let you take them, which a lot of times they are, because they're just very focused on their more narrow game plans from this point forward. So this is a cool strategy for just doing something different. And this is a low to the ground strategy. You tend to have enough cash to do all this nonsense, buy hazards off the board, buy cows for, more than you maybe want to pay for the cow, because you're not buying that many employees. The ones that you've bought maybe 4 of them, and you've thrown them all into stations and don't have any anymore. So it's really low to the ground strategy, and people look over at your board and they're like, okay, you've got nothing going on there. These little Station Master tiles look really small. People never score that many points off of them, but that's not true. You're going to score a ton of points off of them, because once you have, these tiles, you're going to start evaluating, picking up bandits differently, picking up certificates differently later in the game. You're going to all of a sudden have every action find some way of giving you 3 or 4 points, which is not as powerful as your opponents, but you're doing it constantly, and you're starting from a higher score than many of them have throughout the course of the game. So they don't expect that you're doing well, and people aren't going to get into your way. They're not going to throw buildings in your way because there are other people that they're far more concerned about. Now, this game is not that confrontational, but it is a little bit advantageous to not have folks pay attention to you in that way. All right, let me round the corner here and finish things up with hybrid. Okay, hybrid strategies tend to be slow as dirt. Your goal is to just get employees. Employees is what you're doing when you're doing a hybrid. You can do hybrid engineers cowboys, but I think more oftenly you do something like hybrid engineers builders. And so this might be a thing that you stumble into because you're competing with builders for somebody, and then all of a sudden, like, all the builders are gone, so you decide you're going to buy into engineers instead. You use these builders to set up like a couple things in play, and then you throw them out to claim a couple of these stations along the way. A hybrid strategy also like is tends to be greedier in terms of like trying to claim more of these stations. Like, you can go for this sort of like long range approach that I talked about before, claiming all 4 or 5 stations rather than the 2 or 3 I was advocating for with the far range. If you think that you can then stop and pick up more engineers again, right? This could be one action to do this and hire all these guys and set it up so that these guys who are just changing sizes on me constantly are your rehire after you kind of like, you've built up a huge infrastructure, you bought a ton of people, you drop them off along the way, and now you are back into full, long range mode, and you travel around the side of the track there. This is a very slow strategy to start off with. The points ceiling on this is like absolutely bananas, and your opponents shouldn't let you get away with this. It's a very money hungry strategy. It's going to require you to not be taxed regularly. It's going to require big income from bandits. And so what it wants is a game where the players are moving slowly, but it's not because the game is taxed to death. And that might be because, you're the one who's doing a lot of taxing because you've got the builders out there, and so you're slowing them down, but for some reason they're not slowing you down. That might be just like a good initial setup. If you're able to pull this off, like, you can win, but you have to be really deliberate with your actions. And what I mean by that is like, you're basically hiring people and moving the train and building. And you really need that mostly to get you across the finish line. And it's very challenging. I guess I'm really stumbling here because I think that the hybrid is very powerful. You're going to see people pulling this off and be impressed by it. But I think that it is more incumbent on the other players at the table to notice what you're doing and keep the game's pace moving. And if the other players at the table are not doing that, I think that it is more a failure of their strategy than a success of your strategy. If you have some way of being very wealthy and doing this, this is great because I have played games where I play far range, where I pick up just 2 station masters, get to the end of the track, and then suddenly it's like, oh, well, what am I going to do from here? Like, there's still time left in the game, and I've rung the bell. There's nothing else to do. Well, I do want to remind you that if no one else has claimed other station masters, you can back up into the station master row here and claim them from there. That's probably not the case. Other people probably did claim those station masters along the way. I find that this hybrid strategy works really well when I'm playing against weaker opponents because they tend to dilly-dally about with like doing bad engineering strategies themselves, and that's not necessarily progressing the speed of the game. So that's generally when I find that I can get away with this. But I would really recommend you focusing on more the far range or the station master approach as you're getting into this. And then when you're feeling greedy, give it a shot and see if you can just have all the employees and then drop off all the employees and how that works for you. I hope this discussion on engineers was helpful for you. Love to hear your thoughts in the comments. I'm sure there's stuff that I have not mentioned that are cute little tricks or things that you just disagreed with. So thanks for watching. Hope you have a wonderful day. See you all at some conventions soon. Oh, I forgot. I should tell you to, if you're going to Vegas, to use my link, which is, I'll put it in the comments. Okay, bye.